An old man entered the upscale restaurant, his weathered coat and quiet demeanor drawing sneers and whispers. The waiter, smug and dismissive, treated him as if he didn't belong. But when the man left, he didn't just leave a tip. He left a message so powerful, it turned the entire restaurant upside down. Appearances deceive, but actions reveal the truth. Want more stories that surprise, inspire, and keep you guessing? Hit subscribe and join us for the next unforgettable twist. The restaurant was alive with soft jazz and the hum of diners' conversations. Polished wood floors gleamed under the golden light of crystal chandeliers, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the aroma of simmering sauces. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of delicate dishes. It was a place of refinement, where the clinking of silverware was almost musical, and laughter rose in polite tones. Harold Bennett stepped through the ornate glass doors with a deliberate slowness. He paused for a moment to take in the scene, adjusting his hat with the slightest tilt. He was a man of quiet elegance. His coat, though well-worn, was meticulously clean, and his shoes, polished to a shine, reflected the care he took in presenting himself. A briefcase, its leather cracked and softened by years of use, dangled loosely from his hand. As he approached the hostess stand, her smile faltered ever so slightly, though she quickly recovered. Her eyes darted to his attire, and in that fleeting glance, Harold recognized the unspoken judgment he had encountered countless times before. "Table for one?" she asked with a thin-lipped smile, her voice polite but guarded. "Yes, please," Harold replied, his voice deep but gentle. He looked around, his dark eyes soft but observant, taking in the ornate decor and the patrons clad in designer clothes. He noticed how the hostess hesitated, glancing at the seating chart as though unsure where to place him. She eventually led him to a small table near the kitchen, tucked away from the grand windows that offered a view of the bustling city streets. The table was functional but lacked the warmth and ambiance of the better spots. Harold thanked her anyway, removing his hat and setting it carefully on the table. His movements were deliberate, as if every gesture carried weight. Around him, the faint murmurs of other diners became just a touch louder. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others indifferent, but a few lingered with quiet disapproval. Harold was used to it. He straightened his posture, folded his hands on the table, and waited patiently for a server to arrive. Ryan strode toward Harold's table with the energy of someone who had been rushed off their feet all day. He was young, in his early 20s, with sharp features and a perpetual smirk that often bordered on disdain. His uniform was immaculate, but his posture conveyed impatience. As he approached, his eyes scanned Harold from head to toe, and a flicker of something, dismissiveness perhaps, crossed his face. "Good afternoon," Ryan said, his tone clipped and perfunctory. "Can I get you something to drink?" Harold looked up and smiled warmly. "Just some water for now, thank you." Ryan nodded curtly and turned on his heel, muttering under his breath, "Figures." The words were quiet but not quiet enough. A woman seated a few tables away glanced up, her brow furrowing as if she had overheard. Harold, however, seemed unfazed. He unfolded the menu with steady hands and began to study it carefully, his expression calm. When Ryan returned with the water, he placed it on the table with a quick clink and stood there, tapping his notepad with the end of his pen. "Ready to order, or do you need more time?" he asked, his voice carrying the faintest edge of impatience. Harold glanced up from the menu, his gaze steady. "I'll take the salmon, please, and a side of roasted vegetables." Ryan scribbled the order and didn't bother to hide the smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good choice," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "It's one of the more affordable options." The comment hung in the air, its sharpness softened only by Ryan's feigned politeness. Harold's eyes met his, unwavering. "Thank you," he replied simply, his voice as calm as ever. Ryan walked away, muttering once again, "Some people just don't know their place." This time another diner, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, turned to look at Harold's table, his expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Harold took a sip of water and set the glass down gently. His eyes wandered to the framed photographs on the walls, images of the restaurant's early days and its founder, a man with a proud smile shaking hands with local dignitaries. Harold's gaze lingered on one photograph in particular, and his lips curled into the faintest smile. He had seen that photograph before, though no one in the room would have guessed how or why. Harold folded his hands again and waited. He had always been patient. Time, after all, had taught him that lessons worth learning often came at the cost of waiting. The restaurant hummed around him, the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation forming a backdrop to Harold's quiet contemplation. He noticed the subtle choreography of the servers as they navigated the dining room, their movements polished, their smiles bright. Yet when Ryan passed his table again, his gait changed, more hurried, more dismissive. He didn't slow down to check on Harold, didn't glance in his direction. It was as if Harold had become invisible. Harold observed this without a word, his expression serene. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than confrontation. It was a lesson he had carried with him from his youth, when he worked long hours cleaning offices while others overlooked him, assuming he was nothing more than part of the furniture. Back then, he had used their ignorance to his advantage, listening to conversations, absorbing information, preparing himself for a future they could not imagine. A young couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes flickering toward Harold. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line of discomfort. "Do you think he's in the right place?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the soft jazz. Her partner shrugged, his expression unreadable. But they both returned their attention to their plates, leaving Harold in their peripheral vision. The hostess returned, walking briskly past Harold's table to guide a group of well-dressed patrons to their seats. She greeted them with effusive warmth, her smile wide and genuine. "Right this way, Mr. Donnelly. We've reserved a window table for you." Harold's eyes flicked toward them briefly. The man at the head of the group, a tall, silver-haired gentleman in a tailored suit, acknowledged Harold's presence with a fleeting glance, one of those brief looks that seemed to appraise and dismiss in the same moment. Harold returned the glance with the faintest nod, his composure unshaken. Ryan returned to Harold's table after a long wait, his demeanor unchanged. He placed the plate of salmon and vegetables down with a deliberate lack of care, the plate clinking lightly against the table as it landed. "Here you go," Ryan said, his tone devoid of warmth. He didn't ask if Harold needed anything else. Instead, he turned to leave before Harold could reply. Harold studied the plate in front of him. The food was neatly arranged, but the vegetables had cooled to lukewarm, and the salmon lacked the vibrant sheen of a freshly prepared dish. He took his fork and knife, cutting into the fish with steady hands, unbothered by the imperfections. The older man in the tailored suit at the nearby table leaned slightly toward his companions, gesturing subtly in Harold's direction. "Unusual clientele for a place like this," he said in a low voice. Harold caught the words but made no indication that he had heard them. Instead, he continued to eat, savoring each bite as though nothing in the room could disturb his peace. The hours seemed to stretch as Harold sat at his table, eating slowly, savoring each bite despite the tepid temperature of the food. Ryan continued to ignore him, tending to his other tables with a brightness that contrasted sharply with his curt demeanor toward Harold. Emma, a younger server with kind eyes and a tentative smile, watched the interaction from across the room. She had noticed Ryan's behavior earlier and felt a pang of discomfort at how he treated the elderly gentleman. Emma wasn't new to the restaurant business, but she'd seen enough in her few years to recognize prejudice when it surfaced. When Ryan passed by her station, she leaned in and spoke quietly. "You should check on table 5, she said, glancing toward Harold. "You've barely been over there." Ryan scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What's the point? He's not going to tip anyway. People like that don't." Emma's brows furrowed, her lips pressing together in disapproval. "People like what, Ryan?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to catch him off guard. "Come on, Emma," Ryan replied with a smirk. You know what I mean. No, I don't, she said firmly. Her tone was calm but carried an edge of frustration. She looked back at Harold, who was now quietly wiping his hands with a napkin, his plate nearly empty. And you don't either. Maybe you should think about that. Ryan shrugged, brushing her off. You're too soft, he muttered before walking away. Emma watched him go, shaking her head before making her way toward Harold's table. Excuse me, sir, she said softly, her voice warm and respectful. Harold looked up, his deep eyes meeting hers. There was a kindness in her face that contrasted sharply with Ryan's dismissiveness. Is everything all right with your meal? Harold smiled faintly. It's fine, he said. Thank you for asking. Emma hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask. I'll make sure you're taken care of. He nodded. You're very kind. Thank you. As Emma walked away, Harold's eyes followed her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He could sense her sincerity, and it gave him a small measure of comfort in what had otherwise been an indifferent experience. Across the room, Ryan was taking another order, oblivious to the exchange. His arrogance seemed to grow with each passing moment, his interactions with customers polished but insincere. Meanwhile, Emma's quiet gesture of kindness had not gone unnoticed. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes flickering between Harold and Emma, and their expressions softened. Harold reached into his briefcase, pulling out a small leather notebook. He opened it to a blank page and began to write, his pen moving with slow, deliberate strokes. His face remained calm, but there was a quiet resolve in his movements, as though he was writing something far more significant than words on paper. Though no one else could have guessed it, the balance of the room had already begun to shift. Harold knew it, even if Ryan did not. Harold finished writing in his notebook, carefully tearing out a page before folding it and tucking it neatly into his briefcase. His movements were unhurried, his demeanor calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. Purpose, maybe, or a quiet determination. He placed his utensils neatly on the plate and leaned back slightly, taking in the room. The restaurant had grown busier as the lunch hour reached its peak. Tables were filled with diners engrossed in conversations, their laughter and chatter blending into the ambient jazz. Waiters darted between tables, trays balanced expertly in their hands. Amid the bustling energy, Harold remained an island of calm, his quiet presence standing out not for its loudness, but for the dignity it carried. Ryan finally approached again, though it seemed more out of obligation than genuine interest. He picked up Harold's empty plate with a practiced efficiency, barely glancing at the man seated before him. "Anything else?" he asked, his tone clipped. Harold shook his head. "No, thank you. Just the check, please." Ryan smirked faintly as if he had expected nothing more. "Sure thing," he said, turning on his heel without another word. From across the room, Emma watched the interaction, her jaw tightening. She could see the subtle way Ryan's shoulders tensed whenever he approached Harold, the way his words carried an edge that wasn't present with other customers. It bothered her deeply, but she knew better than to confront him directly while they were still on the floor. Instead, she busied herself with her own tables, though her thoughts kept returning to the quiet man at table 5. Meanwhile, Harold glanced out of the window near the kitchen, his thoughts drifting. The memory of his wife came to him suddenly, her laugh light and musical, like the tinkling of wind chimes. They had often eaten together at restaurants like this, though back then they had been young and struggling, saving for every special outing. He could almost hear her voice, teasing him gently for wearing the same old coat, even after their fortunes had changed. "You've earned better than this, Harold," she would say, her smile both playful and proud. "But I love you for staying grounded." The memory warmed him, but it also sharpened the sting of the present moment. Harold had built his life on principles of respect and humility, yet here he was, being judged once again by someone who couldn't see beyond his surface. Ryan returned with the check, placing it on the table with a casualness that bordered on carelessness. "Here you go," he said, his voice devoid of the polite charm he used with other customers. He didn't wait for a thank you. instead walking away quickly, as if eager to put Harold out of his mind. Harold opened the checkbook and examined the bill, his face impassive. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled a pen from his pocket and began to write. Ryan busied himself at the far end of the restaurant, tending to a table of young professionals who were laughing loudly and ordering cocktails. He was in his element here, bantering easily with the group, flashing a smile that was both charming and calculated. They responded warmly, joking with him as though he were an old friend. At the same time, Emma noticed Harold rise from his seat. He placed the checkbook neatly at the edge of the table, adjusted his coat, and picked up his briefcase. His movements were unhurried, his posture as straight as a man half his age. Emma stepped closer, instinctively drawn to him. "Sir, was everything all right?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the din of the dining room. Harold turned to her and smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried a warmth not easily described. "Everything was fine," he said. "Thank you for your kindness." Emma nodded, though a faint crease of concern lingered on her brow. "If there's anything else I can do for you." "You've done plenty," Harold said, his tone reassuring. He gave her a slight nod and began walking toward the exit. As he moved through the restaurant, a few heads turned to watch him leave. There was something in his demeanor that commanded attention, not loud or ostentatious, but calm and resolute, as though he carried a secret that no one else in the room could fathom. When Harold reached the door, he paused for a moment, glancing back briefly at the dining room. His gaze landed on Emma, and he nodded once more, a silent gesture of gratitude. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Back at Harold's table, Emma noticed the checkbook still sitting untouched. She walked over, intending to clear it away, but stopped when she saw the envelope resting on top. It was addressed to her in elegant handwriting. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, her heart pounding slightly as she unfolded it. Inside was a check made out in her name, the amount so large that she gasped audibly. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "For those who serve with grace, not judgment. Pay it forward." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the note, her hands trembling slightly. She turned toward Ryan, who was still chatting animatedly with his table of professionals, completely unaware of what had just transpired. The sound of Emma's gasp caught the attention of a nearby diner, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit. He leaned over, curious. "What is it?" he asked, his tone low but intrigued. Emma handed him the note and the check without a word. The man's eyebrows shot up as he read it, his expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. "Do you have any idea who that man was?" he asked, his voice louder now, catching the attention of nearby diners. Emma shook her head, still too stunned to speak. "That was Harold Bennett," the man continued, his tone filled with awe. "The founder of Bennett Enterprises. He owns half the properties in this district." A murmur spread through the room as the name began to sink in. Patrons whispered to each other, their gazes darting toward the door where Harold had disappeared moments earlier. At the back of the room, Ryan finally noticed the commotion. He frowned, walking over to Emma. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone tinged with irritation. Emma turned to him, her expression a mix of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. "You might want to take a look at this," she said, handing him the note. Ryan read it, his face draining of color as the words registered. His smirk was gone, replaced by a stunned silence that hung heavily between them. For the first time that day, Ryan was at a complete loss for words. Ryan stood frozen, staring at the note in his hands as though it might catch fire. The dining room's usual hum of conversation had shifted. It wasn't silent, but the atmosphere had changed, the energy charged with curiosity and intrigue. A few diners craned their necks, trying to get a better look at what had caused the sudden stir. Whispers swirled around the room, each hushed voice carrying a note of incredulity. Emma remained by Harold's now empty table, clutching the envelope tightly. Her eyes flitted between Ryan and the tailored suit diner, who was explaining to the growing circle of onlookers just who Harold Bennett was. "You don't just own properties if you're Harold Bennett," the man said, leaning forward for emphasis. The guy built half the skyline in this city. I've been to charity galas where he's given millions, yes, millions, with barely a word about it. He's the kind of person who doesn't need to flaunt his wealth because his reputation speaks for itself. Emma felt a swell of awe and disbelief. She thought back to the way Harold had spoken to her, soft-spoken, kind, without a shred of the arrogance she had seen in so many other affluent customers. She glanced down at the check again, the zeros staring back at her like they didn't belong. Ryan, meanwhile, could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, realizing he had nothing to say. The note in his hand might as well have been a flashing neon sign, spelling out his failure in a language everyone could read. "How could you treat him like that?" Emma said finally, her voice cutting through the low murmurs. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried an edge that made Ryan flinch. "You judged him before he even sat down. You assumed you knew everything about him." Ryan bristled, his instinct to defend himself kicking in. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered, his words more to himself than anyone else. "That's the point," Emma shot back. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic decency." The tailored suit diner chimed in, his tone cool but pointed. "You might want to rethink how you approach your job. Word gets around fast when someone like Harold Bennett is involved, and I can't imagine this will reflect well on you. Or the restaurant." Ryan's face flushed red, the color creeping up from his neck like a warning light. He glanced around the room, aware that the whispers had turned into stares, every person in the restaurant dissecting his reaction. His usual smugness was nowhere to be found, replaced by a nervous energy that made him look younger, almost boyish in his discomfort. Emma stepped back, her expression softening. She could see the cracks forming in Ryan's defensive exterior, the realization of his actions sinking in, but she didn't offer him any further words of comfort. This was a lesson he would need to process on his own. Across the room, the hostess approached, her face pale. She whispered something to the restaurant manager, who had just stepped out of the back office, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he scanned the room. It was clear that the events unfolding had caught the attention of more than just the diners. Outside the restaurant, Harold walked slowly along the busy sidewalk, the crisp autumn air brushing against his face. He paused near a park bench, setting his briefcase down and sitting for a moment. The faint sounds of the city swirled around him, horns honking in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the chatter of passers-by. Yet, Harold's mind was elsewhere. He thought back to the note he had written for Emma, the words carefully chosen. He had seen the kindness in her, the way she had approached him not out of duty, but genuine care. That kind of humanity was rare, and Harold wanted her to know that it didn't go unnoticed. His thoughts shifted to Ryan. Harold hadn't missed the way the young man had avoided his gaze, the subtle sneers, the dismissive tone. It was a behavior Harold had encountered more times than he could count, though it no longer surprised him. What did surprise him, though, was how little anger he felt. Harold had learned long ago that anger often wasted more energy than it was worth. Instead, he had chosen a different approach, an approach that didn't just address the moment but left a lasting impact. Back inside the restaurant, Ryan was still rooted to the spot, clutching the note in one hand and the check in the other. He could feel the gazes burning into him, but the weight of his own guilt was heavier than any of the stares. The restaurant manager finally approached, his brow furrowed as he looked between Ryan and Emma. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. Emma, still holding the envelope, handed it to him without a word. The manager read the note inside, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the message. When he saw the name on the check, his expression shifted from surprise to something more serious. Concern mixed with an understanding of just how significant the situation had become. He turned to Ryan, his voice low but firm. "Care to explain why Mr. Bennett felt compelled to leave a note like this?" Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt trapped, like a child caught in the act of wrongdoing. The usual excuses that would roll so easily off his tongue now felt hollow, inadequate. The manager shook his head, letting out a slow breath. "This isn't just a bad look for you, Ryan. It's a bad look for all of us. I'll be having a word with you in my office once we've cleaned up this mess." Emma watched the exchange in silence, her feelings a mix of satisfaction and pity. She didn't relish Ryan's discomfort, but she knew it was necessary. People like Harold Bennett didn't come along often, and when they did, they left a mark. Not just with their actions, but with the way they made others reflect on their own. As the manager walked away, Ryan sank into a nearby chair, the note still crumpled in his hand. For the first time that day, he looked truly small, as though the weight of his actions had finally settled onto his shoulders. Meanwhile, Emma carefully folded the check and tucked it into her apron pocket. She knew exactly what she would do with it. Harold's words, "Pay it forward," echoed in her mind. She didn't know him well, but she knew enough to understand that his generosity came with a purpose. It wasn't about the money, it was about the lesson. In the back of the room, the tailored suit diner leaned toward his companions, his voice low but emphatic. "That man might be gone, but I guarantee people will be talking about this for weeks, maybe longer." And indeed they would. Harold Bennett had left the restaurant, but his presence lingered, his quiet act of grace rippling outward in ways no one could yet fully grasp. The restaurant gradually settled back into its usual rhythm, though an unspoken shift lingered in the air. Patrons continued their meals, their conversations now tinged with curiosity about the events that had just unfolded. The man who had recognized Harold Bennett's name remained at his table, recounting stories he'd heard of the mogul's quiet philanthropy and unmatched business acumen. His voice carried the reverence of someone who understood the weight of Harold's presence. At the same time, Emma retreated to the break room for a moment of quiet. She unfolded the note and reread it, her fingers tracing the elegant handwriting. It wasn't just the check that moved her, though its amount was staggering. It was the message. "Pay it forward." Simple words, yet they carried an extraordinary depth. She thought about the times she had been overlooked, treated as though her worth was tied to her uniform or the job she did. Growing up in a small town, Emma had faced her own share of judgment. Her family wasn't wealthy, and she had taken this job to help pay for her younger brother's school supplies. She'd often wondered if people saw her as anything more than the girl who carried trays and poured water. But Harold had seen something in her. That realization brought a lump to her throat. She folded the note again, tucking it back into her pocket as she returned to the floor. Ryan was still seated at the far end of the dining room, his usual confidence completely eroded. He held the crumpled note loosely in one hand, staring at it as though the words might rewrite themselves if he stared long enough. Around him, his co-workers gave him a wide berth. Some were indifferent to his discomfort, while others exchanged glances that ranged from sympathetic to exasperated. Emma approached cautiously, her footsteps soft against the polished wood floor. When she reached Ryan's side, she hesitated before speaking. "Ryan," she said finally, her voice steady but not unkind. He glanced up at her, his face pale. "What?" he muttered, his usual sharpness replaced with defeat. Emma pulled out a chair and sat across from him. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "What happened today, it's not just about Mr. Bennett. It's about how you treat people, period." Ryan flinched at her words, but didn't interrupt. "You judged him the second he walked in," Emma continued. "You decided he wasn't worth your time because of how he looked, because he didn't fit into whatever box you've built in your head, and now you know you were wrong." Ryan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think I don't know that? Trust me, I get it, I screwed up. But it's easy for you to say you're the one he gave the check to." Emma's jaw tightened. "This isn't about the money, Ryan. It's about what he was trying to teach us. Do you think he left that note just for me? He wanted both of us to learn something. But you have to want to learn it." Ryan looked away, his gaze landing on the checkbook Harold had left behind. For a moment, his expression softened, as though the enormity of the moment was finally sinking in. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted quietly. "You start by doing better," Emma said. "Not just when someone turns out to be rich or important, but with everyone, every single day." Ryan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he exhaled deeply. It was the first time Emma had seen him look vulnerable, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a glimmer of hope that he might change. Meanwhile, Harold had made his way to a nearby park, its winding paths lined with trees whose leaves had begun to shift into vibrant hues of orange and gold. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and fallen leaves. Harold sat on a wooden bench, his briefcase resting beside him. A group of children played nearby, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other across the grass. Harold watched them with a faint smile, his thoughts drifting once more to his late wife, Eleanor. She had always loved parks like this, finding peace in the simplicity of nature. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn and slightly frayed. The image showed a younger Harold and Eleanor standing in front of the first building he had ever purchased. Their smiles were wide and full of hope, their hands intertwined. He ran a thumb over the photo, the memory bringing both comfort and an ache that time had yet to dull. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low and filled with affection. "You always believed people could change, even when I wasn't so sure. I hope you're right." As he sat there, lost in thought, a young man approached, jogging lightly toward the bench. He was dressed in a hoodie and running shoes, a pair of earbuds dangling from his neck. He paused, glancing at Harold with a friendly smile. "Mind if I sit?" the young man asked, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. "Not at all," Harold replied, shifting slightly to make room. The young man sat, leaning forward to catch his breath. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, gesturing toward the park. Harold nodded. "It is. A good day for reflection." The young man chuckled. "You don't see a lot of people just sitting anymore. Everyone's always in a rush." Harold smiled faintly. "Sometimes, slowing down is the only way to truly see what's around you." The two fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't require words. Harold glanced at the young man, noting the energy and optimism in his posture. He was reminded of himself at that age, filled with dreams and determination. After a few minutes, the young man stood, brushing off his hands. "Well, I'd better get going," he said. "Thanks for letting me sit for a bit." Harold nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to linger in the air. As the young man jogged away, Harold remained on the bench, his thoughts once again returning to the restaurant. He hoped that the message he had left behind would resonate, not just with Ryan and Emma, but with anyone who witnessed the moment. Back at the restaurant, Emma glanced toward the window, a faint smile on her lips. She didn't know where Harold had gone, but she felt certain that his actions would ripple far beyond the walls of the dining room. For her, they already had. Inside the restaurant, the buzz of activity gradually resumed its usual rhythm, though an undercurrent of unease lingered among the staff. Ryan remained seated at the corner of the dining room, his mind racing. For years he had carried himself with the brash confidence of someone who believed he knew people at a glance. He prided himself on reading customers, separating those who were worth the effort from those who weren't. Today, that perception had shattered. The manager approached Ryan's table, his expression unreadable but his steps deliberate. He sat down across from Ryan, folding his hands on the table. For a moment he said nothing, letting the weight of the situation sink in further. "You know what this looks like, don't you?" the manager finally said, his tone low but firm. Ryan nodded, though he didn't meet the manager's gaze. "I do," he murmured. The manager leaned forward slightly. "Harold Bennett isn't just some wealthy guy who can afford to tip generously. He's a man people respect, a man people talk about. You've turned a routine lunch into something that's going to reflect on this restaurant for weeks, maybe longer." Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I wasn't thinking. That's the problem," the manager interrupted. "You weren't thinking. You saw an older man not dressed like most of our customers, and you made an assumption. That's not just bad for business, it's unacceptable as a human being." Emma watched the exchange from across the room, her emotions mixed. She didn't enjoy seeing Ryan brought low, but she couldn't deny that he needed this moment. It wasn't just about Harold Bennett. It was about the way Ryan treated anyone who didn't fit his narrow mold of respectable. "I'm sorry," Ryan said quietly, his voice barely audible. The manager sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Sorry doesn't undo what happened. You're going to have to prove that you've learned something from this. Not just to me, but to your coworkers, to the customers who come in here, and most importantly, to yourself." Ryan nodded again, the weight of the manager's words pressing down on him. He wanted to say more, to explain himself, but he realized there was no excuse that would sound anything other than hollow. The manager stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Take the rest of the day to think about this," he said. "You're off the floor until further notice, and when you come back, you'd better have figured out how to do better, because if you don't, you won't be coming back at all." With that, the manager walked away, leaving Ryan alone at the table. He stared at the crumpled note in his hand, the words, "Pay it forward," burning into his mind. Meanwhile, Emma had returned to her duties, though her thoughts remained with the note and the check tucked safely in her apron pocket. As she moved between tables, clearing plates and refilling drinks, her mind wandered back to the moment Harold had looked at her, his eyes filled with a kindness she hadn't encountered often. She found herself thinking about her younger brother, Jack. He was only 12, but already dreaming of becoming an engineer. Their family had always struggled to make ends meet, and Emma's job at the restaurant was what kept food on the table and Jack's school supplies in his backpack. She had taken the position out of necessity, not passion. But she had always tried to carry herself with dignity. Now, with Harold's check in her pocket, the possibilities seemed endless. The amount he had left her could pay for months of bills, maybe even give Jack the chance to attend a summer program he'd been eyeing for years. But Harold's words echoed in her mind. "Pay it forward." The simplicity of the message carried profound weight. At the end of her shift, Emma retreated to the break room to gather her things. She unfolded the note one last time, reading it as though the words might reveal some hidden wisdom she had missed before. She thought about Harold's calm demeanor, the way he had treated her with respect even after enduring Ryan's dismissiveness. As she sat there, the door opened, and the hostess from earlier stepped in, her face curious. "Hey," the hostess said, hesitating slightly. "I heard about what happened with that man, Mr. Bennett." Emma nodded. "Yeah, it was a lot." The hostess sat down across from her, her expression softening. "You handled it well. I mean, better than I would have. Ryan, though." She shook her head, trailing off. Emma glanced down at the note in her hands. "I don't think Mr. Bennett did all of this just to teach Ryan a lesson," she said quietly. "I think he wanted to remind all of us that how we treat people matters, no matter what they look like or what we think we know about them." The hostess nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you think he does this kind of thing often? You know, leaving these huge tips and life lessons behind?" Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I don't think it's about the money for him. It's about the impact. He didn't just leave me a check, he gave me a responsibility to do something good with it." The hostess tilted her head. "What are you going to do with it?" Emma hesitated, her thoughts swirling. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But whatever it is, I want it to make a difference. Something that lasts." The hostess reached out, giving Emma's hand a light squeeze. "If anyone can figure that out, it's you." Emma's smile widened, and for the first time since Harold had left, she felt a sense of clarity. She didn't know exactly how she would fulfill Harold's request, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let his gesture be forgotten. As she left the restaurant that evening, the city lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky, Emma's steps felt lighter. The weight of the check in her pocket wasn't a burden but a reminder, a challenge to rise above assumptions and prejudices, to honor the kindness of a man who had trusted her to carry his message forward. And somewhere, as Harold walked through the quiet streets of the city, he carried a similar sense of peace. He knew that his actions, small as they might have seemed, had set something in motion. What came next would be up to Emma, Ryan, and everyone else who had been touched by the moment. But Harold believed in the power of small ripples to create great waves, and in his heart, he knew that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Emma woke earlier than usual. The light streaming through her bedroom window cast a soft glow across the small room she shared with her younger brother, Jack. He was still fast asleep, sprawled across his bed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of deep dreams. For a moment, Emma watched him, her heart swelling with a mix of love and resolve. Jack was her reason for everything. The long hours at the restaurant, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights worrying about bills. She reached into her apron pocket, where she had tucked Harold's note and the check the night before. Pulling them out, she sat on the edge of her bed, unfolding the note once again. The words felt just as powerful in the morning light as they had the previous afternoon. Pay it forward. Emma thought about the meaning behind those words. Harold hadn't just given her money, he'd given her a responsibility, a chance to create something meaningful. She didn't want to squander it, but she also didn't want to rush into a decision. Closing her eyes, she whispered a silent promise to herself and to Harold. I'll figure out the right way to honor this. Later that day, Emma walked into the restaurant for her shift, the bustling energy of the lunch rush already underway. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh herbs, and the faint clinking of silverware echoed through the dining room. Yet something felt different. The staff seemed quieter, more subdued. Ryan was there, but instead of his usual confident swagger, he moved through the space with a noticeable hesitancy. He wasn't avoiding work. On the contrary, he seemed to be trying harder than usual, checking on his tables more often, smiling at customers in a way that didn't feel forced. But there was a weight to him, as though the events of the previous day were still pressing heavily on his shoulders. As Emma tied her apron and prepared to start her shift, she noticed Ryan standing near the coffee station, staring blankly at a tray of cups. She hesitated for a moment, then approached him. "Hey," she said softly. He turned, startled, and for a moment she thought he might snap at her, but instead he just nodded. "Hey." Emma folded her arms, leaning slightly against the counter. "Rough day?" Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "That obvious, huh?" She shrugged. "You don't usually look this reflective." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about how I treat people and about Mr. Bennett." He paused, his gaze dropping to the counter. "I keep replaying it in my head, how I acted. I feel like such an idiot." Emma studied him for a moment. There was something genuine in his tone, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Well, at least you're thinking about it," she said. "That's a start." Ryan looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and self-reproach. "Do you think he'll come back, Mr. Bennett, I mean?" Emma shook her head. "I don't know. But even if he doesn't, I think the point is to act like he might, to treat every customer like they matter." Ryan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "I'm going to try," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." Emma gave him a small smile. "Good, because nobody likes that guy." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ryan chuckled. It was a small sound, but it carried a note of hope. At the end of her shift, Emma found herself lingering in the break room again, staring at the check and the note. The day had been long, and she was tired, but her mind was too restless to let her leave. Harold's message still weighed on her, but it wasn't a burden. It was a spark. She thought about the stories she'd heard from customers that day. A single mother trying to juggle her kids while enjoying a rare lunch out. A retired teacher who had shared stories of the students she'd mentored over decades. Each interaction reminded Emma of the small ways people's lives intersected, how a moment of kindness could ripple outward. Finally, an idea began to form. She didn't have all the details yet, but she knew she wanted to do something that would benefit others, something that would honor Harold's generosity, in a way that aligned with his quiet, impactful presence. She pulled out her phone and began searching for local organizations, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, a mentorship program for underprivileged youth. one that offered workshops on career readiness, financial literacy, and leadership skills. Emma smiled to herself, her heart racing with excitement. "This is it," she whispered. "This is how I'll pay it forward." The next day, Emma called the organization, explaining her situation and her desire to contribute. The coordinator on the other end of the line was thrilled, inviting her to come in and learn more about their programs. Emma felt a surge of gratitude and purpose as she hung up the phone. Meanwhile, Ryan was also taking small steps toward change. He approached the restaurant manager at the end of his shift, asking if he could attend a customer service training session that was being offered to the staff. The manager raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. "That's a good idea, Ryan," he said. "But remember, it's not just about what you learn in a class. It's about how you show up every day." "I know," Ryan said. I want to be better." The manager nodded, clapping him on the shoulder. "Then start tomorrow." As the days passed, the restaurant staff began to notice a difference in Ryan. He wasn't perfect. Old habits died hard. But there was an effort now, a sincerity that hadn't been there before. And though he never admitted it out loud, the note Harold had left still sat on his bedside table, a constant reminder of the lesson he'd learned. For Emma, the mentorship program became more than just an idea. She began volunteering her time, using the money Harold had given her to sponsor workshops and provide supplies for the students. She even brought Jack to a few sessions, hoping he might find inspiration among the young leaders in the program. One afternoon, as she watched a group of students present their ideas for community improvement projects, Emma felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. She thought of Harold, his calm presence and his unwavering belief in the power of kindness, and she realized something. His impact had only just begun. 2 weeks later, Emma found herself walking into the mentorship program's community center for the first time. The building was modest but vibrant, its walls lined with colorful posters showcasing past events and achievements. Children and teenagers bustled through the halls, some carrying notebooks, others chatting animatedly about the upcoming workshop. Emma paused for a moment at the entrance, taking it all in. The energy was contagious, a blend of hope and ambition that reminded her of her brother Jack. She had used a portion of Harold's gift to fund a new workshop on career exploration, something the program director, Ms. Carter, had enthusiastically supported. As Emma made her way to the main office, Ms. Carter greeted her with a wide smile. "You must be Emma," Ms. Carter said, extending her hand. She was a tall woman with warm eyes and a commanding presence that seemed to put everyone around her at ease. Emma shook her hand, her nerves melting slightly under Ms. Carter's welcoming gaze. "Thank you for letting me be a part of this," she said. "We should be thanking you," Ms. Carter replied. "What you're doing will have a real impact here. These kids need people who believe in them, who are willing to invest in their future. And the fact that you came to us with this idea, it means a lot." Emma smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I just want to make a difference," she said. Ms. Carter led Emma to a classroom where the workshop would take place. The room was filled with rows of chairs and a large whiteboard at the front. On the whiteboard, someone had written in bold letters, "Dream big, work hard, achieve more." As they prepared for the session, Emma shared more about Harold's story with Ms. Carter, explaining how his note had inspired her. Ms. Carter listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like Mr. Bennett knew exactly what he was doing," Ms. Carter said. "He saw something in you, and now you're passing that on to these kids. That's what leadership looks like, creating opportunities for others." When the students began filing into the room, Emma felt a wave of nervousness. She wasn't used to being in front of a group, especially one so full of bright, expectant faces. But as the session began, she found her footing. She talked to the students about her own experiences, the challenges she'd faced, and how hard work and support had helped her navigate life's obstacles. The students listened intently, some nodding along, others raising their hands to ask questions. Emma felt a deep connection with them, especially when one young girl named Mia shared a story about wanting to become an engineer but feeling unsure if she could afford college. Emma's heart clenched as she thought of Jack, who had similar dreams. "You can do it," Emma told Mia, her voice steady and sincere. "It might not be easy, but you have what it takes. And there are people who want to help you succeed, people like the ones running this program. Don't be afraid to lean on them." By the end of the workshop, Emma felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced before. The students filed out of the room, many of them stopping to thank her, their gratitude shining in their eyes. Mia lingered behind, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "Thank you for today," Mia said shyly. "It really helped me. I didn't think anyone understood what I was feeling." Emma crouched slightly to meet Mia's gaze. "You're not alone," she said. "And if you ever need advice or support, I'll be here. I promise." As Mia left the room, Ms. Carter approached, her smile wide. "You have a gift for this, Emma," she said. "The kids connected with you in a way I don't see often. I hope this isn't the last time we see you here." Emma felt her chest swell with pride. "It won't be," she said firmly. Later that evening, as she walked home, the weight of Harold's gift felt lighter. She realized that paying it forward didn't mean solving every problem or changing the world overnight. It meant showing up, doing the work, and believing in others the way Harold had believed in her. Emma pulled out the note one last time, reading it under the glow of a street lamp. The words felt different now, not a command, but a call to action she had already begun to answer. She folded the note carefully, slipping it back into her pocket with a smile. Harold had started something, and she intended to see it through. Days turned into weeks, and Emma became a familiar face at the mentorship program. Her initial workshop had been such a success that Ms. Carter invited her to collaborate on other initiatives. Emma threw herself into the work, using Harold's gift not only to fund additional workshops, but also to sponsor scholarships for students like Mia, who aspired to pursue higher education. One afternoon, as Emma was preparing for a new session on financial literacy, she received a surprise visitor. Ryan stood awkwardly at the entrance of the community center, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if bracing himself for rejection. Emma blinked in surprise. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" He shuffled forward, glancing around the room filled with bustling students and volunteers. "I heard about what you've been doing here," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "The workshops, the scholarships. I wanted to see it for myself." Emma crossed her arms, studying him carefully. His usual cocky demeanor was nowhere to be found, replaced by an almost boyish nervousness. "Why?" she asked, not unkindly. Ryan exhaled sharply, glancing down at his shoes. "Look, I know I messed up," he said. "Big time, and I've been trying to figure out how to make it right. I thought maybe I could help. If you'll let me." Emma's eyebrows rose in surprise. She hadn't expected this, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. But as she looked at Ryan, she saw something different in him, a vulnerability, a genuine desire to change. "What kind of help are you talking about?" she asked, her tone cautious but open. Ryan shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't know. I'm not exactly great at this kind of stuff, but I can take direction. Maybe I could, help set up for the workshops? Run errands? Whatever you need." Emma hesitated, the weight of his offer settling over her. Part of her wanted to push him away, to remind him of how dismissive and arrogant he had been. But another part of her, the part that had been inspired by Harold's example, knew that forgiveness and second chances were part of paying it forward. "Okay," she said finally. "You can start by helping me set up for today's session. We're doing a workshop on budgeting." Ryan's face lit up with relief. "Really? You mean it?" "Don't make me regret it," Emma said with a small smile. Ryan quickly rolled up his sleeves and got to work, following Emma's instructions as they arranged chairs and set up materials for the session. As they worked side by side, Emma found herself surprised by how eager Ryan was to help. He asked questions about the program, about the students, and about Emma's own journey. By the time the students began arriving, Ryan seemed more comfortable, even chatting with a few of them as they settled into their seats. Emma watched from the corner of the room, a mixture of curiosity and cautious optimism brewing in her chest. During the session, Ryan stood at the back of the room, listening intently as Emma guided the students through basic budgeting strategies. When one of the students, a teenage boy named Marcus, asked a question about saving for college, Ryan surprised everyone by stepping forward. "Can I say something?" he asked, glancing nervously at Emma. She nodded, intrigued. Ryan turned to Marcus. "I didn't go to college," he admitted, his voice steady but humble. "Mostly because I didn't think I could afford it. But looking back, I realize it wasn't just about the money. It was about not knowing how to plan for it. If I'd had a program like this back then, I think things might have been different for me. So take this seriously. You've got a chance to do something great with it." The room fell silent for a moment, the students processing Ryan's words. Then Marcus nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. "Thanks," he said. Emma felt a surge of pride, not just for Marcus, but for Ryan. She could see how much effort it had taken for him to step out of his comfort zone and share his story. It was a small step, but it felt significant. After the session ended, Ryan lingered in the classroom as the students filed out. Emma approached him, her arms crossed but her expression soft. "You did good today," she said. Ryan smiled sheepishly. "Thanks. It felt good to be a part of this." Emma nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Keep it up, and you might just make up for the way you acted before." Ryan chuckled. "I'll take that as a challenge." As they cleaned up the room together, Emma couldn't help but think about how far they had both come since that fateful day at the restaurant. Harold's impact had extended far beyond his note and his check. It had sparked a chain reaction of growth, change, and second chances. And as Emma locked up the community center that evening, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just paying it forward, she was building something bigger, something that would continue to grow long after she was gone. Harold had planted the seed, but it was up to her, and now perhaps Ryan, to nurture it into something extraordinary. Weeks turned into months, and the mentorship program flourished in ways Emma hadn't imagined. The workshops she organized, funded in part by Harold's check, began to attract attention from the local community. More volunteers signed up, inspired by the stories of transformation coming out of the program. Emma became a central figure, not just a volunteer, but a leader whose compassion and determination touched everyone she met. One afternoon, as Emma prepared for a session on leadership skills, she received a call from Ms. Carter. The director's voice was filled with excitement. "Emma, I have some incredible news," Ms. Carter began. "Do you remember the community development grant I told you about last month?" Emma did. The grant was a prestigious award given to organizations that demonstrated innovative approaches to youth empowerment. Ms. Carter had mentioned applying, but hadn't been sure if they would stand out among the many applicants. "We got it," Ms. Carter said, her voice breaking into laughter. "We got the grant. $100,000, Emma. Do you know what this means for the program?" Emma felt her knees weaken as she sank into a nearby chair. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Absolutely," Ms. Carter said. "And it's because of you. The review committee was blown away by the impact your workshops have had. They specifically mentioned your budgeting program and the scholarships you funded. This wouldn't have happened without you." Emma pressed a hand to her chest, her mind racing. Harold's simple act of kindness had set all of this in motion. The workshops, the scholarships, and now this grant. It was as though his influence had multiplied, reaching farther than either of them could have anticipated. "That's incredible," Emma finally said. "What's the next step?" "Well, we're going to expand," Ms. Carter replied. "We'll be able to reach more kids, offer more resources. And Emma, I want you to play a bigger role. You've been more than just a volunteer. You're a visionary. I'd like to bring you on as a program coordinator. It's a paid position, and it's yours if you want it." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected this. Volunteering had been her way of giving back, of honoring Harold's trust in her. But now she was being offered the chance to turn that passion into a career. "I don't know what to say," Emma stammered. "Say yes," Ms. Carter said warmly. "You've earned this." After a moment of stunned silence, Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I'd love to." That evening, Emma returned home, the news still buzzing in her mind. Jack was at the kitchen table, hunched over a science project. She sat beside him, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him work. "How's it going?" she asked, ruffling his hair. Jack grinned, his eyes lighting up. "Almost done. I'm going to ace this, you'll see." Emma laughed, her chest tightening with affection. "I have no doubt." As she watched him, she thought about how Harold's generosity had not only transformed her life, but also Jack's. The scholarships she had funded were just the beginning. With her new role, she could do even more, reach more kids, create more opportunities, and continue building the legacy Harold had entrusted to her. Later, as Jack headed to bed, Emma sat down with her journal. She hadn't written in it since the day she received Harold's check, but tonight felt like the right time to reflect. She opened to a blank page and began to write. "Dear Mr. Bennett, thank you for trusting me with your gift. I hope I've done it justice. Your kindness has changed more lives than you'll ever know, not just mine, but Jack's, and Mia's, and Marcus's, and so many others. Today we received a grant that will allow us to expand the program and help even more kids. I've been given the opportunity to work full-time, doing what I love. It's more than I ever dreamed of, and it's all because of you. I want you to know that your words, 'pay it forward,' have stayed with me. I think about them every day, and I promise to keep living by them, to honor your legacy in everything I do. With gratitude, Emma." She closed the journal, her heart full. Somewhere out there, she knew Harold was continuing his quiet work of kindness, planting seeds in other people's lives just as he had in hers. And as she blew out the candle on the table, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." 2 months later, Emma found herself standing at the front of a packed auditorium. The mentorship program was hosting its first community showcase, an event designed to celebrate the achievements of its students and inspire more support for its mission. The room buzzed with energy, filled with families, local leaders, and students eager to share their stories. Emma adjusted the microphone nervously. Public speaking still wasn't her favorite thing, but this moment felt too important to shy away from. She glanced down at the podium, where she had placed a small photograph of Harold Bennett, his calm, dignified face watching over her. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Thank you for being here tonight to celebrate the incredible work of these students, the heart of this program. I'm honored to stand before you as someone who has not only watched their journeys but has been inspired by them every single day." The audience clapped politely, and Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "When I first came to this program, I had no idea how much it would change my life. I came here because of a single act of kindness, a gesture that reminded me how powerful it can be when someone believes in you. That act wasn't just about generosity, it was about trust, about planting seeds that could grow into something far greater than the giver ever imagined." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw familiar faces. Mia, sitting with her mother, clutching a folder filled with college acceptance letters. Marcus, smiling confidently beside his father. Jack, perched on the edge of his seat with a proud grin on his face. "Tonight," Emma continued, "we're here to showcase the results of that belief, that trust. These students have worked tirelessly to overcome challenges, to dream big, and to make those dreams a reality. They are the reason we do what we do, and they're proof that kindness, no matter how small it may seem, can create ripples that change lives." The applause was louder this time, filling the room with warmth. Emma smiled, glancing down at the photograph on the podium. "I want to take a moment to honor the man who inspired this journey, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Harold Bennett. Many of you may know him as a successful businessman and philanthropist, but to me, he's much more than that. He's the reason I'm here today. His simple note, "Pay it forward," has become the guiding principle of my life, and I hope it inspires all of you as much as it has inspired me. She picked up the photograph, holding it up for the audience to see. This, she said, is the face of someone who believed in people, who saw potential where others might not. And because of him, so many lives, mine included, have been changed forever. The crowd erupted into applause, some even rising to their feet. Emma felt her chest swell with pride and gratitude. This wasn't just about Harold anymore. It was about the students, the community, and the future they were building together. As the applause subsided, Emma stepped aside to make way for the students, who began presenting their projects one by one. Each story was a testament to the power of support and belief, of what could happen when someone was given the tools to succeed. At the end of the night, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, Emma stood near the stage watching the students interact with their families and mentors. A familiar voice startled her from behind. "You've done good, Emma." She turned quickly, her heart leaping. For a moment, she thought it might be Harold, but it was Ryan, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. He was dressed more casually than usual, his face free of the smugness that had once defined him. "I mean it," he said, stepping closer. "This is incredible. You've really made a difference." Emma smiled, her heart settling. "Thank you, Ryan, and so have you. I've seen how hard you've been working with the students. They look up to you, you know." Ryan chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "I still feel like I've got a lot to learn, but it feels good, being part of something bigger than myself." Emma nodded, understanding completely. That's what it's all about. As the night wound down, Emma found a quiet moment to herself. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her face. She pulled Harold's note from her pocket, unfolding it for what must have been the 100th time. "Pay it forward." She smiled, looking up at the star-filled sky. "I hope you can see this, Mr. Bennett," she whispered. "I hope you know what you've started." And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the world, Harold Bennett was undoubtedly planting seeds in someone else's life, his legacy of kindness continuing to ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could fully measure. Emma folded the note carefully and placed it back in her pocket. The journey wasn't over, not for her, not for the students, and not for the countless others who would carry Harold's message forward. It was just the beginning of something extraordinary. Emma's journey reminds us of the transformative power of kindness. Harold Bennett's simple act of generosity didn't just change one life, it sparked a ripple effect, proving that belief in others can create opportunities far beyond what we can see. Through her growth and determination, Emma honored Harold's message. Pay it forward. She turned a single moment of compassion into a movement that impacted countless lives, teaching us that even small actions can lead to extraordinary outcomes. This story isn't just about Harold or Emma, it's about all of us. It's a call to look beyond appearances, to give without expecting anything in return, and to trust that our kindness will find its way forward, multiplying in ways we can't predict. What seeds of kindness can you plant today? Take a moment to believe in someone, extend a hand, or pay it forward. You never know how far your impact might reach.